First came October 7th, 2023, the bloodiest day of terror in Israel's history. Then came retribution. And then, well, it never stopped. Gaza entering a new circle of hell with Israeli tanks entering the center of its capital city and the apparent launch of a ground offensive. We'll ask why and why the spectacle is allowed to unfold. The consequences for Palestinians all too obvious. But what about for Israelis? Does the flattening of Gaza kill off sympathy for a state founded in large part by survivors of the Holocaust? Here in Europe, the dark legacy of World War II collaboration with the Nazis is a fading memory for a younger generation, the one that's been the most vocal in calling out what it sees in Gaza. And after Sunday's disruption of the finale of the Tour of Spain cycling race in Madrid, we'll ask what's next, starting with a week from today, the annual opening of the United Nations General Assembly in New York, where many countries are set to recognize a Palestinian state. Today in the France 24 debate, we're talking about the demolition of Gaza City. With us from Washington, Ahmed Fouad Al-Khatib, resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council think tank. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
From Tel Aviv, Gil Dickman, cousin of Carmel Gat, abducted on October 7th from the Be'eri kibbutz, murdered in captivity 1 year ago. Thank you so much for joining us in the show.
Thank you. Good evening.
Rina Bassist is correspondent for the news site Al Monitor and Israeli Public Radio. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for inviting me.
And Dorothee Schmidt, director of the Turkey and Middle East program at the French Institute for International Relations think tank, IFRI. Good to see you.
Good evening.
You can also, by the way, listen to the show wherever podcasts are streamed. Gaza's burning, that's what tweeted the Israeli defense minister overnight. And after the repeated flattening of buildings in Gaza City, now comes the offensive. Oliver Farry has more.
Military officially launched its operation, with Defense Minister Israel Katz saying Gaza was burning as yet more residential towers fell to airstrikes. Israel has called up tens of thousands of reservists and has been preparing the ground offensive for several weeks, despite the misgivings of some high-ranking army officers. Roughly 1 million Gaza City residents had been issued with evacuation orders. Thousands are fleeing towards the so-called humanitarian zone that is already overcrowded and lacking sufficient food, water and shelter.
We have been displaced more than 20 times so far. We have become homeless. Where can I go with my children? My husband is in one area, and my children and I are in another.
About 90% of Gaza's 2 million residents have been displaced. In Israel, protesters have criticised the offensive on Gaza City, saying it puts the hostages' lives in danger. But Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu continues to defend his position.
There's still some strongholds that we have to take apart. They're holding our hostages. We are committed with America to release all the hostages, the living and the dead, and we're not going to compromise on it.
Secretary of State Marco Rubio gave Netanyahu the support of the United States and focused all of the blame on Hamas.
It's a key moment, an important moment. And again, our preference, our number one choice is that this ends through a negotiated settlement where Hamas says we're going to demilitarize, we're no longer going to pose a threat, we're going to disband, we're going to release every single hostage.
According to Gaza's health ministry, Israel's campaign has killed over 64,000 Palestinians, roughly half of them women and children.
And before we go to our panel, let's go to Jerusalem and correspondent Noga Tarnopovsky. Noga, what's the latest?
Well, the latest is that protesters are gathering all over the country, it turns out, in city squares, in all of the major cities of Israel. And the hub of it, the main focus tonight, is in Jerusalem. There's a march right now from the Prime Minister's residence to his office, to his bureau. I don't know. You know, former Prime Minister Ehud Barak has said in the last 24 hours that the only thing that could stop this new escalation in Gaza City, or in his words, could save Israel, is an absolute stoppage of the country, a kind of popular general strike. And I'm not sure, I have to say, that that is what is happening on the streets right now, although there's an effort to organize something like that tonight.
Noga, the people who are in the streets, families of hostages, we'll hear in a moment more from Gil Dickman, or is it broader?
It's absolutely broader, but the beating heart of this movement is our families of hostages. You'll hear from Gil Dickman, including family members of hostages who are no longer around to be saved. I want to mention a few today. Anat Angres, the mother of a soldier who was pulled out of a burning tank by Hamas militiamen on that day and dragged into Gaza barely alive, very severely wounded, and about whom very little has been heard since he was taken captive, is, she stood up today in public and described an almost unbelievable situation. She described being called 10 days ago by her contact people at the IDF in the Israeli army, who simply let her know that her son was now very likely to be killed in this new operation. Today, she accused Netanyahu of perpetrating war crimes by ordering the assassination of her son. That's how she put it.
Noga Tarnapovsky, many thanks for joining us there from Jerusalem. Gil Dickman, there's been no change of course, it seems, from the Israeli government under the pressure of, as you just heard our correspondent say, hostage families and more. What is the next step?
Well, it's very important to understand that us as families of hostages, we warned that that was going to happen. We warned that the IDF is going to get into Gaza and put hostages in danger. We warned about this. And actually, when my cousin 1 year ago was in Rafah, the very same thing happened. The IDF went inside and put her life at risk. She was murdered as a result of this action. And this is why you're seeing more and more families of hostages coming out to the streets and saying this war that was supposed to get the hostages home, was supposed to save the hostages, actually kills the hostages. And that's another reason why we want this to end. Most of the people of Israel, and every poll you get, and most of the people of Gaza want this war to end. And that's why I'll be in Jerusalem tonight, and more people will be in Jerusalem in the next few days.
Ahmed Fouad Al-Khatib, of course, this Tuesday, we don't mention it enough, there's at least 24 who've been killed again. Along with the arrival of tanks in the city center of Gaza, there was also more buildings destroyed. Have you been able to speak to relatives?
Yes, unfortunately, what remains of my family's home in Gaza was completely destroyed. The first floor was actually barely standing, but my uncle, my dad's brother, Uncle Ibrahim, and his family were there, and they fled, and that has been completely destroyed and leveled. This is criminal. What is happening right now is we're seeing I don't understand how the IDF is making decisions about the targeting of a lot of homes, some of which seem to be empty, some of which have already been hit. Some of those residential towers, what is confusing is that they're being targeted after, giving people a chance to leave. But let's assume that you're targeting Hamas or terrorists in there. The element of surprise is gone. If there are terrorists in there, they had fled. To me, this seems punitive. This seems to be a display of merciless, ruthless punishment of the entire population. Now, I want to also add here that, of course, Hamas is a despicable, horrific criminal for refusing to come to some sort of an agreement that could have ended this early, that could have seen them lay down their arms, that could have seen them turn over the hostages, that could have seen them sacrifice for the good of the people of Gaza. So just as we're focused on the criminality of Israel Katz, the defense minister, callously tweeting about Gaza being burned overnight, as if he's reveling in that, as if he's enjoying it and posturing to his base in Israel, we should remember that the people of Gaza City, almost in unison, are all cursing out Hamas, cursing out October 7th, cursing out the armed resistance narrative, and wanting their voice to be heard, that they do not want the continuation of war for some aimless, useless outcome of that is getting them annihilated, getting them destroyed and wiped out.
Not just Hamas that they're cursing, it seems. We spoke earlier with one humanitarian spokesperson for a humanitarian aid group who pointed, and we saw those images just now of the coastal highway in Gaza with people moving their belongings in trucks and vans, and sometimes having to pay $1,000 for a 20-minute ride.
Exactly. So I can't tell you how many. I mean, I've been blessed to have the ability to send in some resources to a lot of my friends and allies in Gaza City. But to evacuate Gaza City, right at this point, has become out of reach. A lot of people, they want to leave, but they're unable to. You need something like $2,000 to move all your belongings. You need something like $800 to $900 for a tent, a Qatari, Emirati, or Saudi tent. You need to find a plot of land to set up shop in there. And remember, you have merchants of death, you have looters, you have bandits along the route. So it is a horrendous war economy. It is every man, every woman, every family for themselves. And so the scenes are horrendous. They are apocalyptic. The breakdown of any social cohesion is truly heartbreaking and just shows the complete collapse of what was once a vibrant, beautiful community and society that has succumbed to 2 years of a merciless Israeli war machine and a despicable terrorist organization's rule.
Rina Bassis, you heard Ahmed Fouad Al-Khatib wonder aloud, why this offensive on Gaza City?
Well, it depends who you ask. Of course, for Prime Minister Netanyahu, he has two objectives, at least this is what he's saying. First of all, to pressure Hamas into a deal that would see the release of hostages, and then at the second stage, to eliminate Hamas so it won't threaten Israel anymore. But we have seen these recent days, not only, we heard now a family member of a hostage speaking, but we have heard this past few days also the chief of the Israeli army raising his voice, not once, not twice, but several times in meetings he had with the Israeli security cabinet against this operation.
Including today, our spokesperson,
yes.
The spokesperson for the military, stating that his boss doesn't agree with what's going on?
Well, we should take, for example, what he said on Sunday, actually, I think, which is very revealing. He was in a meeting with the security cabinet, and at this meeting were, of course, the Prime Minister and the Defense Minister, but also the Minister of Strategic Affairs, Ron Dermer, who is the chief negotiator for Israel, and the chief of the Mossad, who is also part of the negotiating team with the Hamas. And Eyal Zamir, the chief of the military, turned to these two people and told them, why are you here? Why are you sitting at this table? The meeting took place in Tel Aviv. Why are you sitting at this table in Tel Aviv? Why are you not out there trying to get a diplomatic agreement so we could stop this operation before we start, have the release of the hostages, have a ceasefire in Gaza? So the chief of the Israeli military was very, very vocal, the way he can be in closed meetings, but of course everything was leaked about his objection to this operation because of the humanitarian catastrophe, because of the danger to the lives of the hostages, because we are assuming that Hamas transferred most of them to Gaza City to use them as human shields, and of course for the lives of the soldiers, because from his point of view, the Israeli military risked losing dozens and dozens, maybe hundreds of soldiers in this operation. We don't know how long it could take. There were some assumptions it could take as long as 3 months. But I spoke this morning with several Israeli security experts, and they told me that this number it's meaningless. We don't know how long it will take. We will only start understanding how long it will take the moment we see the kind of resistance that Hamas will put on. So we are in for a very, very long period where everybody would suffer. This explained the objection by the army, by the Israeli society, and by the leaders of the Israeli economy also to this operation.
Yeah, there's been objections raised by business leaders. Before I turn to Dorothee Schmidt, Gil Dickman, do you have a short answer as to why this ground offensive on Gaza City is taking place?
Well, we know, just like we heard, that what Prime Minister Netanyahu is saying is that the objective is to get the hostages back and to eliminate Hamas. The way I see it, what Prime Minister Netanyahu wants is for this war to go on and continue forever. And he doesn't care whether it's the family of my colleague here who spoke before me and my family. We suffer from this. The innocent people on both sides of the border suffer from this horrible vision of Hamas and Netanyahu, this vision of a war forever. We suffer from this, and the horrible leaders are actually enjoying it. That's what they want. What we want as the innocent people on both sides of the border is for this war to end. And if you, people watching this, care about Israelis, if you care about Palestinians, you shouldn't support neither Hamas or Netanyahu. You should support an end to this war.
As he left the White House for his state visit to the UK earlier, Donald Trump reiterating what he put out late Monday on Truth Social. He said in that statement, "I've just read a news report that Hamas has moved the hostages above ground to use them as human shields. This is a human atrocity. Don't let this happen. All bets are off. Release all hostages now." Dorothee Schmidt, is the United States actually playing a role here or following Israel's lead?
Well, I think the wording comes from the Israelis clearly, and I think Donald Trump is kind of an echo chamber. I think he has other businesses to do. It's very difficult for him to strike a balance between the different fights he has to handle at the same time. He has Putin on one side. He understood the Middle East is a mess, so I think he doesn't expect it to help him reaching his objective of getting the Nobel Prize. So my concern is not necessarily about the declarations of Trump, but what Marco Rubio said after visiting Jerusalem, there was unabated support to Israel, which I think has to be understood in the more global context of the next General Assembly meeting, where we know there will be a sort of a big diplomatic rally around the idea of a Palestinian state. And I think the unsaid objective of the operation in Gaza is to clearly make it definitely impossible to have a Palestinian state, because you destroy all Palestinian artifacts, living, or any manifestation of identity, of Palestinian identity on Palestinian soil. So I think it has to go, it goes with the clear nervous mood of the Israelis in this context of diplomatic pressure, of international diplomatic pressure. But I'd like to say again 2 words about the 2 objectives that were said. When Netanyahu says that he wants to bring the hostages back, but he says living or dead. What does that mean? You want them living. Otherwise, it's a false objective. And the other one is to eliminate Hamas. But you cannot tell Hamas from a normal, a civil, a lame man in Gaza. So it's also a very elusive objective. So, of course, you don't have to systematically take the wordings of the Israeli for granted, to take their objectives as a decent roadmap or as a feasible roadmap, as a realistic roadmap. They're only slogans.
You mentioned the U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio, who went from Israel to Qatar, where last week there was the Israeli targeting of a Hamas political meeting, which was meeting to discuss a U.S. truce proposal.
This is actually another sort of very important evidence that the Israelis are not looking for a ceasefire.
Are you surprised that the reaction, there's been a lot of strong wording from the Qataris, has been relatively muted? They didn't call out the United States.
So I think they're kind of helpless because they still count on the US as the number one international power, as the only one who can sort of exert any influence of Israel and restrain Israel. So they still have to calculate the Americans in. But Marco Rubio asking Qatar to keep on mediating is just now giving them an absolutely impossible mission. You know, the next very nervous state in the region is Egypt. And Egypt has had the steadiest agreement with Israel. I mean, since they signed peace with Israel, it has not moved. And now President Sisi has called Israel an enemy yesterday.
Ahmed Fouad Al-Khatib, we saw that big meeting on Monday of Gulf states, an Arab League meeting with Organization of Islamic Cooperation that took place in Doha. There was a family photo where we saw the Saudi Crown Prince, the head of the UAE, who then departed. When you look at the messaging from Egypt, from the UAE, from Saudi Arabia, what conclusions do you draw? Because they do have leverage, don't they, with Donald Trump?
Look, I think the Israelis have gravely miscalculated. I think, unfortunately, the Israelis take for granted their friends, as some in the region have stated in private meetings that I had with them. But I think the Qataris were trying to show that they can punch above their weight, and that despite some of their ideological differences in the past with Egypt, with the Saudis, with the Emiratis, they've assembled this array of Arab and Muslim countries to show that, listen, we have the backing and the depth and the legitimacy of the Arab and Muslim world, and that you, the United States, must make a decision and really balance out your commitment to us from a security and a diplomatic point of view, and vis-a-vis your security and diplomatic relationship with Israel. And I think the Qataris are somewhat facing an existential crisis to the national security underpinning that has really empowered the gas-rich emirate, if you will, because they've relied on the presence of the Al Udeid Air Base and the United States as the safety guarantor. They bought American weapons, American radars, they've bought Western weapons. And when those failed to detect incoming Israeli aircraft and missiles last week, they're panicking. They're wondering, like, is this really the future? Is the United States really going to look after us? If the Iranians struck us about a few months ago, and now the Israelis are striking us. So as for Qatar's role in the negotiations or the mediation efforts, I don't really see that going anywhere, nor do I see the Egyptians enthusiastically jumping in to actually make, to supplant the Qataris, because both are seeing that, on the one hand, Netanyahu is not really serious about reaching a deal, but they also register that Hamas, we need to be talking about Hamas and calling them out. Hamas wants to reign. They don't want to rule Gaza. They want to step back from governance. But Hamas wants a deal that allows them to remain in power. And that's not viable for the Israelis. That's not viable for the Americans. And so I think the Arabs are sort of throwing their hands in the air and saying, all right, Israel, you broke it. You fix it. You deal with it. And they're, unfortunately, in so doing, leaving the Palestinians to their own fate. Yes, they're providing humanitarian aid and support, the Emiratis, the Saudis, and others through Egypt. But beyond that, I don't really see anything on the horizon to push the United States or Israel to end the war. And that's going to be sad and tragic for my people.
All right, so we've talked about what the U.S. has done, siding with the Netanyahu government, the Gulf reaction. Here in Europe, what we're seeing is an erosion of public sympathy for Israel. We saw the disruption of Sunday's finale of the Tour of Spain cycling race. Disruptions stoked by the presence during the 3-week race of the privately sponsored Israel Premier Tech team. It was followed up with Spain, now joining the likes of the Netherlands, Ireland, and Slovenia, warning they'll boycott the Eurovision Song Contest if Israel's invited. That on top of this call from the Prime Minister regarding sporting events.
I think sports organizations need to ask themselves whether it's ethical for Israel to continue to participate in international competitions. Why was Russia expelled after the invasion of Ukraine, but Israel is not expelled after the invasion of Gaza?
Rina Bassist, your reaction to that as an Israeli living in Europe?
I think the reaction of the Spanish Prime Minister is shameful. I mean, you can't do this comparison. I'm sorry. Israelis experienced 7th of October. You can't say that on Russia. So the two events, if you put them together, it's very, very hard to swallow. I can understand that there are people demonstrating against the Israeli policies, against Netanyahu's willingness to continue the war. But the way this is done and the way the Spanish Prime Minister is bragging that all sportive events should sanction Israel, that's not the way to advance things. That's not the way to advance any dialogue between Israelis and Palestinians. On the contrary, that's a way to make Israelis feel ostracized, that they have nobody to talk to anymore, including all of these people who do not support the policies of Netanyahu. And you can't avoid the linkage that we see all over Europe from October 7, the rise in anti-Semite actions. I mean, you can't disconnect it from all of these calls and approaches. So I understand very well the opposition that is manifested against the Netanyahu policies, but I should expect politicians, first of all, and decision makers to be very, very careful to stop this linkage. I mean, Israelis do not feel safe in Europe. Israeli tourists don't feel safe in Europe. Jews in Europe don't feel safe. This is not a normal situation.
Dorothee Schmidt?
I think the reaction of the Spanish government is a minority one. I think it's very radical. So I think it's quite unusual. So I see in most of the countries, the governments trying to balance very carefully because they're afraid that this would reverberate on the social climate between communities, especially in France. This is very clear. But I think we've also being faced, especially here in Paris, with unjustified accusations that we're fueling anti-Semitism. I think the attitude of the American ambassador, the small feud they had with President Macron was really a shameful one. I think Macron did a lot to try and keep the balance and to show that he was really in an attitude of protection of the French Jews. And I think altogether it held. I think France has not gone to extremes on that. So I find it interesting to hear the Spanish Prime Minister like jumping on the radical, with the radical crowd.
Rina Bassist talked about being careful in choosing your words. Spain, like, for instance, Ireland, are countries that during World War II, what happened wasn't really part of their history.
Yes, but they should share that history with the rest of Europe. So that's what I wanted to say also, that it plays into the internal EU debate. So a few states who could be considered like not necessarily in leadership politically have taken a more radical stance. But what matters is what the French do, the Germans do, and we still see the Germans very much in support of Israel. The UK is out now, but in sort of trouble also to keep the balance. But I mean, traditionally, historically, the EU has done a lot in support of the Palestinian state, establishing the Palestinian Authority, and they tried to have a sort of consensus. And now the European consensus is not in favor of sanctioning Israel so far. We'll see what happens after this new episode that goes apparently to the full destruction of Gaza. This might move a little bit, but still, at that moment, the Spanish and the Irish opinion are marginal, I say, in Europe.
All right, the other end of the spectrum, speaking after a human rights panel this Tuesday qualified the campaign in Gaza as a genocide, Israel's prime minister dismissing critics, particularly here in Europe.
Western Europe has large Islamist minorities. They're vocal. Many of them are politically motivated. They align with Hamas. They align with Iran. They pressure the governments of Western Europe, many of whom are kindly disposed to Israel, but they see that they're being overtaken, really, by campaigns of violent protest and constant intimidation. And so they fall into this siege. And we can break this siege.
Gil Dickman, when you listen to Benjamin Netanyahu, is it as strong on the other end of the spectrum as with that clip we played earlier of the Spanish Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez?
Well, I think you can see that Netanyahu is using this Hebrew saying that we have the whole world is against us, העולם כולו נגדנו. So the people of Israel will feel that what the world is thinking about the war is only because of anti-Semitism and because they hate Jews. And that's why I think promoting ideas of hate is only helping Netanyahu and Hamas. And it will only help the continuation of the war. We should be more focused on getting any other solutions for this issue, for Eviatar David, who's suffering from hunger in Hamas tunnels, and for innocent people in Gaza suffering from this horrible thing that we're seeing, the actions of the IDF. We can promote this kind of policy, I think, if we do this together, if we focus on ending this war. And I'm very much afraid that Netanyahu is using all of this rhetoric, all this extreme rhetoric against Israel as an internal weapon to try to make Israelis more concerned about the world. And I urge people, when they speak about this war, when they speak about the situation, remember, we as Israelis are also victims of this horrible situations. Palestinians are, of course, victims of this horrible situation. The two leaders, the leaders of Hamas and Benjamin Netanyahu, are trying to make this war as long as they can. They are to blame for this, not the people of Israel, not the people of Gaza, not the hostages, and not the people fleeing from Gaza City.
All right, let me ask you this, because we're seeing live images there of a press conference being given by the Israeli Prime Minister. Our correspondent was telling us that part of it is to dial back a little bit remarks that were made Monday. It's the front page of left-leaning Israeli newspaper Haaretz. Benjamin Netanyahu saying Israel should brace itself for more international isolation and become a super Sparta. Gil Dickman, this idea of us versus them, Benjamin Netanyahu's been underestimated before. Can us versus them work for him again?
I'm afraid so. And I think he knows why he's using this kind of rhetoric on Israeli public, because he knows how much Israelis are afraid of these kind of threats on our lives. And we were all suffered, and we were all here on October 7th. My family, my aunt was killed, and my cousin was kidnapped and then killed in captivity. And so I think he knows what he's doing when he does this. But this is going 100% against the interest of the Israeli people. Because if we understand that what this guy is doing, what Netanyahu is doing, is actually ruining our future and turning us against the world, I think when people around the world understand this, then it will be very easy for them to understand what we're going through. As the people of Israel, we want this war to end. We want this guy who's in charge for what happened on October 7th and this horrible war that preceded it. We want him to get out of office, and we want a better future, not only for us, not only for Israelis, but also for the people on the other side of the border, for the people of Gaza. We deserve this, and I really hope that we as Israelis can rise up from this and turn away from this horrible rhetoric of us versus them.
All right, this pressure being brought to bear on Israel, it's small compared to the support that the United States is providing for the Netanyahu government. In Brussels, the European Council is to review its association agreement with Israel in a Wednesday meeting. There's talk of more targeted sanctions against some of those who are inside of the cabinet of Benjamin Netanyahu, and more nations looking to a Franco-Saudi initiative to symbolically recognize a Palestinian state in a bid to press for peace and a two-state solution. Luxembourg, not the largest member of the European Union, the latest to join the likes of Britain, Australia, Canada, Belgium, who during UN week are slated to recognize a Palestinian state. Still, as Dorothee Schmidt was alluding to earlier, for historical reasons, Germany, all the while criticizing Israel's offensive in Gaza City, not ready to recognize a Palestinian state.
Germany has decided to participate in the conference on the two-state solution, which our close partner France is organizing together with Saudi Arabia next week. I will personally attend the conference in New York. We've also supported a corresponding resolution in the UN Security Council. We remain of the opinion that a Palestinian state should not be recognized at this time, but that a two-state solution must be possible.
Ahmed Fouad Al-Khatib, what are you expecting from Europe, and what are you expecting from that opening of the UN General Assembly that starts next Tuesday in New York?
Well, multiple things are true at once. On the one hand, I expect a lot of symbolic resolutions, and the recognition is certainly symbolic, though I actually think of a recognizing Palestinian state at this time is an kind of a symbolic but important line in the sand that says, hey, we're not about to give up on the existence of the Palestinian territories and simply act as if we don't see what the Israeli government is doing in the West Bank, with Ben-Gvir and Smotrich pushing for annexation, with the rapid expansionism of Israeli settlements that are really not only preventing the establishment of a Palestinian state, but eating away at existing Palestinian communities and reducing them to a set of isolated cantons, if you will. If Israel was fearing the charge of apartheid, it is increasingly making itself vulnerable to such a charge by its behavior in the West Bank. And so in that regard, I think allowing the state of Palestine to exist as a polity, as a formal entity, regardless of its borders, regardless of its governance, of course, we need to figure out who runs the state. And I don't think a Soviet-style Palestinian Authority or a terror organization in Gaza are the answer to the governance. I don't think an aid-dependent failed state is the answer either. But that can come at a much later state. And I will also point out for historical fact, I would have liked an ideal situation where, like the Zionist project and the establishment of Israel, a lot of institutions and a lot of the state apparatuses were set up before Israel was formally declared in 1948. On the other hand, what I would much prefer we see from the Europeans at the United Nations, whether it's the French and all the allies that your reporting mentioned, or even the Germans who are reluctant to engaging in recognition, are concrete tactical and strategic steps that actually make a difference. Tactical when it comes to the provision, not just of aid, but actually pushing for something beyond just let's send things to Kerem Shalom, let the aid get intercepted, let's actually create humanitarian cities in the areas in the north. I flew over Gaza 10 days ago, and I saw with my own eyes while I was flying on an Emirati Air Force plane doing food airdrops. The vast areas of Gaza that are destroyed in the north, in the east, in the center, that could totally be repopulated by people on a temporary basis. Let's actually reduce the congestion and the suffering in the south. Let's set up parameters for what the West Bank can and should look like. Let's call for a great reset. 100 days in the West Bank where everybody just holds their ground, no one is hurt. We set up a goal for 100 days. We reset everything. We can do a ceremony where we can do whatever. No settler violence, no Palestinian violence, no shootings, no nothing. And we release the tensions in the West Bank so that there isn't a third intifada and the Palestinian Authority doesn't collapse. Let's work strategically with the Arabs, the Emiratis and the Saudis on what can they actually do with European cooperation. Because the United States, I think, has unfortunately failed to prove that it is a viable, objective player in this space. So that's what I would like to do, to see rather, instead of just a bunch of symbolic acknowledgements. But just really briefly, super quick, 30 seconds, if I may, about the earlier point. I agree with some of my colleagues that some of the rhetoric coming out of Spain and some of this, very labeling all Israelis as they're all Likudniks, they're all should be boycotted. I supported boycott when it was very targeted against specific settlements, very targeted against officials, the Ben Gvirs and Smotriches of the world. But this idea that you can sanction all Israelis, that you can erase them out of sight, that you can blame all Israelis for what is happening right now is so harmful, and I would argue destructive, because we as Palestinians and global peace communities, we need Israelis. We need them, as partners, to actually work to end this. Over the weekend, I was in Toronto, Canada, at the Haaretz conference. Haaretz, for God's sake, it doesn't get more lefty than that. Newspaper. And you had a large number of pro-Palestine protesters protesting the Haaretz conference outside. I mean, in what world is that helpful? In what world is that actually building towards a strategy? Similarly, I think some of these declarations by European countries create a permission structure for some of their activists and NGOs and ministers to begin normalizing the generalization of all Israelis as being legitimate targets for boycotts and sanctions. And I don't think that's helpful. I think that's actually harmful. And I think there's an element of that where it could actually be bigoted and racist, targeting people strictly because they happen to have an Israeli passport.
Very briefly, because we're running out of time. Rina Bassist, what are you expecting from UN Week?
I understand the idea, the logic behind the French-Saudi initiative. I understand that President Macron is thinking that we have to impose a new paradigm, to introduce a new dynamic so things would change, because all the other attempts, all the quartet and all the international conferences, everything failed so far. I understand all of that. The problem is that this is one of the biggest cards of France and of the European Union. And the question is, what are they getting in return? It's true that in the declaration of New York, the Arab states are saying, yes, Hamas should not rule Gaza anymore, Hamas should be disarmed, but they are not committing to doing anything concrete. They could say, we will declare Hamas a terrorist organization. They could say, we will expel, and this brings us back to the Qatar issue, we could expel all Hamas people. They could say, we will freeze all of Hamas accounts abroad to push them into an agreement. They are not doing that. So we are staying on a declarative level, and France is paying with this bigot card, not getting too much in return, I think.
We're out of time. Dorothee Schmidt.
I think the French, it's quite an anomaly that the French did not recognize the Palestinian state earlier. So I think maybe it's a big card, but it's sort of normalizing with history. I think they do provide a lot of wording about the security guarantees for Israel, for the two states. So I think it's very much addressed in it. And I think what matters is that the Saudis are the partners. And after the Doha summit, I would expect more working of the Arab diplomacies and the GCC's diplomacies together on
All
this.
right. And we'll be definitely talking about it next week here on the panel. Many thanks, Dorothée Schmidt. I want to thank as well Rina Bassist, Ahmed Fouad Al-Khatib for joining us from Washington, Gil Dickman in Tel Aviv. Thank you for being with us here in the France 24 debate.